Thank you for joining us for another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum where all voices matter. As the federal budget inches closer to being revealed, real questions are being asked about Canada's fiscal sustainability and economic health. With a national debt of over $1 trillion and your share about $30,000 and climbing, is all of this really manageable? To answer, we welcome the return of Aaron Wudrick, the federal director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, to discuss all of this with us. Aaron, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Tony.
I guess first things first, can you describe in your own words the economic health of our country?
Well, it's pretty grim stuff. I mean, obviously, with the pandemic on and so many shutdowns, it's been a struggle for millions of Canadians and Canadian businesses. The only good news that we got recently on that front is a lot of the forecasts from the big banks and international agencies suggest that, next year, 2022, will be a pretty good one. Growth rate of 5%. Granted, that's from a very low starting point because the economy has shrunk. But it's better than hearing that things are going to be sort of continually gray sky going forward. So not so good news for the immediate future, but in the sort of medium term, there might be some silver lining.
Let's take it to another important question connected to that, though. I asked you about the economic health, and you gave the important answer. But we also have to talk about the fiscal health of our Canadian government and the provincial governments. What's your assessment of that?
Well, obviously, there was a whole whack of unplanned spending that went out the door over the last year or so. It is at a scale that we haven't really seen since the Second World War. So for most people, nothing in their lifetime of this scale. We're looking at a deficit of over $360 billion. So that's twice the size of the budget itself. It is just off the charts in terms of the size. And, questions are starting to be asked about what comes next. I know a lot of people will agree that in an emergency, they had to spend some money. There was no getting around that. But there needs to be some accountability for what was spent. And more importantly, what comes next? What is the government prepared to do to get spending back under control? Because we've run up the tab a lot, and it's simply not realistic to think that we can never turn that tap off and never find a way to claw our way back to a balanced budget.
Yeah, and I was going to ask this later in the broadcast, but you brought it up now. With the federal budget happening mid-April, I guess all of us kind of were initially expecting that this would be a forward-looking document to, to your point, how do we get ourselves out of this situation or not, depending on the choices the federal government makes. But, with the latest wave 3 of COVID and the lockdowns in various provinces, do you expect that this is going to be a kind of an interim measure now, still looking at fighting COVID rather than looking ahead? What's your prediction?
Yeah, I don't expect there to be a lot of spending reductions, put it that way. I don't expect the government's going to be putting a lot of these temporary programs behind them. And if anything, we're going to see new temporary programs. We've been waiting 2 years for this budget. The argument that the argument that the government has been making all along is that things are changing so rapidly, we can't afford to have a budget. Well, I guess they finally decided they had to come up with one. The thing that I'm really going to focus on looking for in this budget, Tony, is are they going to implement new permanent spending that has nothing to do with the pandemic? If there are measures that are helping businesses and individuals, tiding them over during this time, I think that's reasonable, and we can debate the sort of merits and tinker at the edges. But if they're going to roll out big, new, expensive programs that have nothing to do with the pandemic, that seems like a pretty cynical move to just exploit the crisis as a pretext to do things that they simply wanted to do all along anyway.
Well, stick a pin in that, because we are going to return to that. As the old adage says, never let a good crisis go to waste. We may be in that unfortunate period right now. But we got about less than a minute before the break. But I do want to ask you, your organization, it's always been about current deficits, meaning future taxes. Is that still the thing that you're stressing to people?
Yeah, look, obviously the dynamic has changed a bit, and we need to be realistic about how quickly we can climb out of this. But I think, if anything, Tony, it's actually become a lot more relevant and real to people. Talking about deficits and debt has always been very abstract, but because of this pandemic, most people have personally experienced what it's like and understand what we've had to do. So hopefully that gives people a little more steel when it comes to paying back what we've had to borrow so far.
We're speaking with Aaron Wudrick. He is the federal director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, talking about all things federal budget and the fiscal outlook for the country. We'll return to that conversation after the break. Please stay with us. And welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, as always, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum, here with Aaron Wudrick. He is the federal director of the Canadian Taxpayer Federation. Aaron, based on our initial discussion before the break, I'd like you to break it down, in terms of the message you have for a particular segment of our demographic segment of our population, namely the millennials and the Generation Zers. You talked about how unprecedented this situation is in terms of deficit, debt, and the fiscal framework. Nobody who's under 40 has ever experienced anything even close to this. So how do you, as an organization, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, how do you make sense of this for millennials and Gen Zers?
Well, first of all, just highlighting the fact that a lot of these young people are going to be the ones stuck paying the bills. If not them, then their children. So we're not just talking about the pandemic debt. We're talking about all the debt racked up until this point. And I think a lot of people find it troubling that, these are people who are just getting started out in life and they're already being saddled with this colossal debt on their shoulders. And these are obviously not the only challenges they're facing. We have a graying population, so there are fewer people going in the workforce. That's going to be more people, taking money out of the system and fewer paying in. And then, of course, the big elephant in the room that no one's able to deal with right now is the housing situation.
Right.
I mean, you have almost no hope if you're a millennial, unless you have a big inheritance or parents willing to help you. It's almost impossible to buy a house in major cities in this country. So it's a challenging time to be a younger person. But our message really is the sooner we get things under control fiscally, the less painful it will be for younger folks.
Yeah, and obviously this, as I keep stressing, this is a generational group that hasn't had to deal with anything close to this situation, or indeed their parents close to this situation in the past. So are you finding kind of willing ears for this? Is there starting to be an understanding or a reckoning that these kinds of things are unsustainable, or is it still a tough message that you've got to deliver?
It is starting, and I think obviously the pandemic's not over. So I think that the idea of cutting spending on certain things right now is a non-starter. People are still scared; they want reassurance, and spending money is one way that governments do that. But I do think there is a big difference between temporary measures and permanent ones. And that's where it's going to be interesting to see if this government does roll out permanent programs. I think they may be conflating acceptance for temporary spending that's for the pandemic with an acceptance of just spending forever on all sorts of other unrelated things. I don't think those are the same thing. And I'm not sure that the public is on board with the latter.
This is an important point because, as you said at the outset, let's face it, a lot of the focus still is on fighting COVID, getting your vaccination appointment, these very near-term issues for the public. I agree with you. That's where the public is focused right now. So again, I'm putting it out to you as a representative of your organization, the Canadian Taxpayer Federation. How do you have that dialogue with people, understanding that people are facing a very short-term crisis situation, but that there is going to be a need to talk about the longer-term picture? How do you settle that?
Well, I mean, one is to acknowledge, and it's unusual for us, right? Usually we're quite the skinflints when it comes to spending on anything. We understand it's an emergency. And so we're going to cut more slack, on program design, on things like waste. We don't think that means you have no accountability. We still think things like Parliament scrutinizing and governments explaining where things went wrong are important. But we just remind people that we'll do what we have to do right now, but there's going to come a reckoning. And I think most people accept that. I think most people are willing to borrow through an emergency. And again, they implicitly understand that, you had to borrow to save lives and save businesses. But at some point, we're going to have to find a way to pay for that. And that's going to be a challenging process.
Do you draw a comparison with their own situation, with their own household finances? Is that sort of something that people understand?
Yeah, I mean, the credit card analogy, I know it's not perfect and sometimes people don't like that I use it, but it's an easy way for people to understand. If you had a sudden household situation, a medical emergency or something, and you had to, borrow money, or you had to fly to a relative's funeral, a continent away, you had to borrow money to do it. You do it because you have to, but you also know that that comes at a cost and there's interest and you have to pay it back. So I think the nature of the situation we're in, people are more willing to borrow to survive, but they're going to be more willing to say, yeah, you know what, we're going to have to find a way to claw our way back afterwards.
We'll return with our special guest, Aaron Wudrick, Federal Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, after the break. Please stay with us. And we're back here at the News Forum, Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Aaron Wudrick, Federal Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Aaron, you talked before the break about accountability, and that's always been, again, something that the Canadian Taxpayer Federation has been very concerned about. I know it's a process issue in a sense. How is Parliament making sure that money is spent in the right way, et cetera? But it is an important aspect of what you do because obviously things can go very wrong when there's little or no accountability. So talk a little bit about that role for the CTF at a time when we've been in this crisis now for a year and Parliament isn't working the way that we're used to it working and so forth. So maybe just paint that picture for our audience too.
Sure. A lot of people, it's like you said, it's a process issue. So it seems kind of abstract and it doesn't matter. But because of the nature of the emergency and the speed at which things are moving, first of all, Parliament's not able to scrutinize and serve its challenge function the way it might normally be able to, especially with a minority government. But we've already seen that this government in particular has tried to evade responsibility. They've specifically tried to shut down Parliament at times. They've prorogued. They have avoided sending people to committee. So that's troubling. And that means that groups like the CTF and the media have to, work harder to sort of shine light on things. And that includes everything from asking hard questions to pressuring ministers to, for example, filing access to information requests, which, again, another sort of abstract thing that a lot of people don't think about, but it's an important tool for regular Canadians and journalists to be able to just uncover what's happening in government. So there's some transparency, so we understand what's going on and we're able to form judgments and hold people accountable for it.
So what sort of things have you uncovered, or what sort of things are you communicating to the public that you have discovered through your access to information or that media have uncovered as well?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, we've seen what has come to light because of the scandal. That's probably the biggest ticket item. This is something that was rushed through. A lot of protocols were not followed. I know the finance minister at the time resigned, apparently, but it's not hard to connect the dots and suggest that that scandal had something to do with his departure. So that's one example. Our organization in particular has dug up information on, for example, the Governor General's spending on her residence, which was astronomical sums of money. And, more recently on issues of a so-called home equity tax. Mm-hmm. We uncovered some documents about the Crown Corporation. The CEO had argued that he was not looking at that tax, and yet there's emails showing he had emailed with a researcher suggesting they were spending money, CMHC money, to study the possibility of a home equity tax. So these are things that if no one is checking, you're never going to uncover them.
So just so our viewers understand, the home equity tax would be a tax on your primary residence. Is that right?
That's right. And as you can imagine, it'd be extremely unpopular. There are a lot of Canadians who have essentially sunk their entire, savings into their homes. And in many cases, their homes are all that they have. So the idea of springing a tax on them when they sell their home, right now they don't have to pay any tax on a primary residence if they sell it. That could run hundreds of thousands of dollars for people and really just throw any of their investment planning for a loop.
So where does that stand now?
Well, the government insists they're not looking at it. I probably think that's a wise idea politically. But look, this is a government that also said that they were going to balance the budget. They said they were not going to increase the carbon tax. They've made lots of promises, and it later turned out not to be true. So I have to take them at their word right now. But if people are skeptical about it, I certainly couldn't blame them.
We've got less than a minute before the next break. Anything else we should be looking for in the budget? You talked about new programs that are not COVID related. Can you unpack that a bit more? Are there other things that you're looking for?
Yeah, I mean, they've talked a lot about childcare. They've talked about pharmacare. These are things that all sound good on paper, not directly related to the pandemic, but we could be talking about tens of billions of dollars of new spending. And the government really has not fleshed out, how it's going to pay for any of it.
So those are other things that we should be looking for when the budget comes out. Looks like the NDP at their convention are looking at free tuition for everyone and some other things as well. So there's not going to be a lot of push from the Liberals from the left to do less spending, it looks like.
No, and again, it's very strange because a lot of these big ticket items, Tony, they were never on the table before the pandemic. And you would think, intuitively, we've spent more than we planned, so we should have less to spend on these things. And yet the government is now insisting that it has the capacity to spend on these new things when, strangely, before the pandemic, they were not on the table.
We'll return for our final segment with Aaron Wudrick. He's the Federal Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Please stay with us. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, and we're discussing all things federal budget with Aaron Wudrick, the Federal Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Aaron, your organization has done a good job in the past of connecting what has to be seen as sometimes rather esoteric issues. And we talked about accountability, but also some of the substantive issues. You've tied that very effectively with people's own household budgets and the future sustainability of those household budgets. Is this something that you expect that you'll be doing post-budget as well?
Yeah, I mean, look, we've talked a lot about how the government has had to borrow for an emergency. And I think a lot of people can understand because they've personally been affected. I mean, so many people have lost work, they've lost hours, they've had family members that have been impacted that way. Small business owners, of course, have been hammered amongst the worst of anyone. And so, they have had to personally experience borrowing to survive. And so I think there's going to be an expectation, they have to claw their way back. They're going to demand that of government as well, rather than just simply have the government come and say, hey, we're going to raise your taxes and ask you to pay for it.
Right. And, this does intersect with the economists in Canada and others, other watchers, I suppose, of budgets saying, look, it's important for Canada to have a fiscal anchor, that is to say, a way to get back from the hole that we are in, through fault of the pandemic or whatever, but we're in a hole. And you're basically saying the same thing, but you're seeing it from the point of view of the taxpayer. Is that right?
Yeah, you can call them fiscal anchors, you can call them guardrails. You just need to have some way to measure whether things are getting out of control. And I think one of the most frustrating things over the last year has been the government's refusal to do that. I mean, the Minister of Finance, Krista Freeland, has said, she said in the fall economic statement that, they were going to put up guardrails, but they didn't want to do it yet. And that kind of defeats the point. If you're driving around a steep cliff, you need the guardrails where the cliff is. You don't wait till you get back down on level ground to put up the guardrails. And yet that seems to be what this government wants. They seem to acknowledge the need for these guards, but they do not want to impose them on themselves right now.
So a budget comes out. I mean, one of the other good things that has been very effective from the Canadian Taxpayer Federation has been, the debt clock and having a visual way to illustrate the situation or the fiscal crisis, that kind of thing. What sorts of things do you expect to be doing post-budget?
Well, stay tuned for a new debt clock because I may have mentioned to you, they actually broke our old one. We actually, there's not enough digits on our old debt clock. So it's kind of funny. They spent so much money that even at the Taxpayers Federation, we never anticipated we'd need $1 trillion on that debt clock. So we are getting a new debt clock. So I'm sure that will make a debut sometime later this year. But look, the visual is important because for a lot of people, these numbers get so big that they're all the same. And when you break it down to the individual level, and you mentioned off the top about 30,000 Canadian, it ranges a bit depending on what province you're in, combining federal and provincial, but it's a lot of money, and it's $1 billion a day that it's going up. So it's a substantial sum. It's something people need to have, in their face sometimes so that they can understand the gravity of it, because otherwise, it all just sounds like it's free stuff coming that sounds great, and no one's worrying about how it's going to be paid for.
We've got less than a minute, but one of the things I found really effective from Pierre Poilievre was, they've spent per capita, per person, $40,000 or whatever the number is. Did you receive from the government $40,000 worth of government expenditure? And the answer clearly is no.
Sure, and that applies to our general approach to taxes. You don't have to be ideological to think that people pay their taxes because they expect certain things in return. They expect good value for the taxes they pay. And if you start asking them for more and more and more, but they feel that they're not getting more or they're getting less, they rightly start to ask questions about whether the government is focusing on their priorities and things that are important to them.
Aaron Wudrick, it's been a pleasure having you back. I'm sure we'll have a discussion post-budget as well, but I wish you well, sir.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Well, you certainly heard it from Aaron Wudrick, the federal director of the Canadian Taxpayer Federation. Lots to look for in the next federal budget. New programs, unsustainable programs, taxation levels. All of these things will be certainly grist for the mill as we get towards the next federal budget. So boom and bust will be there. We'll be obviously commenting on it as it happens as well. Please stay with us.